Good morning, everyone. This is Jim Chastain with EasyPower. Welcome to the Tuesday refresher. The primary purpose of this series is to cover a bit more depth on specific aspects of the tools, usually for tool owners, but certainly as an exposure to people that are trying to learn more about the tools. Today we're going to be talking about Scenario Manager, and as our usual habit, I'd like to start with some poll questions to get some feedback from the audience. So if you would please accommodate me with some participation. First question is, how many scenarios do you normally include in a project? Got three possible choices. Again, just wanted to get some feedback and in terms of the audience and maybe how it pertains to the topic that we're at hand. All right, let's leave this open for 5 more seconds and share the results. So here's how folks voted on that question. And then the next question is, do you duplicate scenarios for every scenario you currently have for a with and without motor condition scenario? And again, there's nothing binding about this. It's just an indication of how people look at the task. And it does complicate the matter in terms of how to track changes in scenarios, which I think is going to be the heart of where we're going today. So let's leave this open for about 5 seconds. Appreciate the feedback. Here's how folks weighed in on this one. And then finally, in regards to labeling on emergency generators, where that can easily be the worst case in terms of arc flash incident energy calculations, I'm curious how you would handle the situation of an emergency generator being the worst case when it's probably the least often condition that the system will be in operation. And again, it's more for feedback. There's not any hard and fast rule that I'm trying to enforce or even suggest. And again, thank you for participating. Here's how folks voted on this one. Again, usually showing that it looks like majority talking about the worst case incident. Thank you much. So let's kind of get on with the show here. So rather than being an exhaustive discussion of the Scenario Manager, this topic was suggested or has come up because in recent weeks I've had several people ensure in the process of evaluating the tools that there were certain capabilities that I could verify with EasyPower that weren't available in some of the other tools on the market. And because I don't use the other tools, I'm just kind of taking that as some feedback that I need to amplify or share with the users. So we're going to be talking primarily about basic capabilities. And one of the variations in the discussion is what is considered a change in the system and when and where changes may affect what I think I'm doing in terms of scenario management. So again, these are not hard and fast rules. They're just some suggestions on how to manage the workflow, and in some cases document your methodology as much for reminding yourself as well as someone that maybe steps into your position after you leave for parts unknown and they are trying to figure out what you were trying to do. And again, that particular scenario has come up recently with a tool owner, and we're going to be talking about this briefly, but there's a large system that he inherited, and part of that layout was a number, looks like maybe a couple dozen different scenarios, and I'm kind of show you the file here in a second, but the bottom line is this dialogue, or this consideration of different scenarios, is driven by the recommendation in the IEEE 1584 documentation to consider two sets of calcs for a simple system, and the first set being the maximum utility with all motors, or all large motors contributing or included, and then the other scenario being the minimum utility contribution or short circuit and no large motors included. And then they just basically say for more complex systems you may want to have multiple scenarios, in particular when you're considering minimum current source. So again, this is not a directive on what to do about that. It's more how the tool gives you certain capabilities when you have to deal with this in a project. So here's a system that large file reflects, some subset of it. And the point that I want to make here is when we look at the scenario, there are easily a dozen or 18 or so different scenarios. I want to point out the following fact. I've already got these scenarios developed. Once I select any particular scenario, the tool will give me a report and show me what is different from this scenario compared to the base case. And this can be as small, if you will, as just the colors were changed, or specifically the equipment condition was modified. And that's why there's, I think, room for documentation as far as my methodology when I hand this file off or haven't worked on it for some amount of time. Now, the problem that existed, well, let me kind of go back. So now once I'm in this file, if I use this zoom out full magnifying glass at the bottom here at the top, the bottom of the top, I've changed the look or the layout of the one line, and I'm in the base case. If I want to now go in and open one of these scenarios, the tool says the one line has changed since it was last saved, and it's talking about the base case. So do I want to save before continuing or reopen? All I've done, just to make a note of this, is to zoom out. So if I save it, that means the next time that the file is opened, it will be in this zoomed out condition. If I want to reopen the previously saved case, it takes me back to the original setting that we were looking at as far as zoomed conditions. And now when I look at or open some scenario, let's just take this one without motors for the overall system. And what I want to look at is the short circuit current duty as opposed to the arc flash incident energy. So now I have an error message that says some scenario changes could not be applied. Do you want to view the error report? Well, the tool kindly gives me a list of all, it doesn't even show me what particular items are included. It does give me a clue though in terms of what scenario was being impacted. So the point here is that I want to emphasize is that when we establish a base case and then we make a scenario based on that or springing from that, once we make changes in the base case, it could negatively impact the scenario we've created, and consequently we need to either be aware of that or delete it. In this case, it's showing me the scenario, but it's hard to tell what the missing, in fact, I kind of see some evidence over here of some loads missing, but it's difficult to understand, what the impact of that missing scenario is. Okay, so that's a headache that this one facility engineer inherited. Turns out, because every scenario that he had was impacted by this particular problem, he basically had to start from scratch in developing what scenarios he had and understanding what they are. So let's kind of back up one and go down the path in a little more methodical condition. I've drawn up a very simplistic one-line diagram. And again, if I look for a scenario, there's no scenario indicated, again, because I haven't saved this file in any condition. And I can tell that by the labeling up here showing one line 1 base case. So if I save this with a name, I'm going to go ahead and save it where in a file I've already pre-created and replace that file. Now the same situation happens. Let's say I want to zoom out to full screen and I want to create a new scenario or even open a scenario. It asks me if I want to save the one line before continuing or reopen it. So that, again, this is a condition of saving something that changed in the base case, and we can either reopen it where it's not saving any changes, or we can save the one that we have right now. All right, so what I want to do is create a scenario now with no motor contribution. I know I have motor contribution in my base case because if I go out in an open space here, right click, I can see include motor contribution as a condition of this particular one line. So what I want to do is uncheck that and save this scenario now as a no motors without motors. So I'm going to store this scenario as no motors. Now as I do that, I don't know if you can see this, but the colors of the motors changed to green, or whatever color this is. And so the tool, when I'm in no motors, it gives me an indication of what's being affected. If I go back to my base case, again, because I've zoomed in slightly, it wants to know if I've saved the changes. So let's say I don't. And when I go back and reopen the scenario, no motors, it's got the settings that I basically saved initially, and the motor contribution. Now I also want to disengage or create a scenario that includes just one motor, but I don't want to do it from this scenario because again this scenario has no motor contribution as a global option. So in this case I want to go back to the base case. I'm just kind of, if nothing else, brainstorming how I want to do this. So I'm in the base case. I want to make sure that I have motor contribution included, and now I want to, and again I've zoomed in, do a change. I want to open up this particular breaker. So let's open up the dialog box, open the breaker, save it. Now I don't want to save it in the base case, I do want to save it in my scenario manager. So we're going to store the scenario as one motor. And now if I had done this from the no motor contribution, I'd have an issue of essentially a change that I didn't want. So now I'm in the one motor case. It's indicating that my breaker is open and with a color change. Now let's say I don't like this particular pukey color, so let's go off and change it to a different color just for grins. Now if I go back to my base case, again I've made changes to this scenario. Do I want to store it? I don't want to store changes I inadvertently make, but in this case I know I've changed the color. And now when I look at my open scenario, one motor report, it shows me that the equipment's been modified in terms of the breaker, and it's changed the color to something without giving me specifics on it. So at least I have a clue of what I did during that scenario. I'm in the base case. Now I'm ready to produce my scenario report. And to do that, and I'm going to use equipment duty because I know I have some comparisons here with the short circuit current and the contributions from the motors where I will get at least some interesting results. Now, again, it's asking me if I want to change the scenario report, change the changes to this file, and the only change I've made to the base case is zooming in and zooming out. So I'm going to discard those changes. It goes back to my original file, and we're going to create a report. Now, what I'm looking for is equipment duty. And so what we're looking at BL1 is the base case is the worst case, and we're showing that the breaker has a duty cycle rating of 35,000 amps and it's being exposed to 28,000. BL2 exposed to 25,000 and it's being exceeded by the surge on the bus. But in all three cases, we have the base case as the worst case situation. Likewise, the tool will show me my over duty devices, and in all cases, it ends up being BL2, which is on bus 1. All right, let's kind of go. So I'm happy with that. That gave me the results I was looking for. I'm back in the base case. Now what I want to do is create a change where I'm going to replace this fuse, or excuse me, this breaker with a fuse. So let's take this breaker out. I'm doing it in the base case. Let's put a fuse in. And let's put in a generic all right, so it's easily going to be accommodate the surge. Now, just because we're here, I'm going to look at the short circuit. I take that back. I want to save this. No, I don't want to save this because I don't want to save it as a separate scenario. I do want to save it as part of my base case. So I'm going to go in and generate my report again for equipment duty. It says, do I want to save changes for my for the file? The answer is yes, and it's going to affect all the different cases I've created. Again, replacing that breaker with the fuse. But now I also get this error list that there are some scenario changes that could not be applied. Again, this will give us an error report, and just to look at what it is, under the one motor scenario, it's having some items that it can't find. It's not giving me too many more clues than that, but obviously it's going to be that breaker that we had replaced. So let's go back and look at what the results now show me. It does show all devices basically passing, if you will. There's nothing that's over dutied, and as before, the worst case is still the base case. So let's go look at my one motor scenario. And again, it's giving me an error report. We know what it says, so I'm not going to show it. So now the scenario shows the fuse because I changed this element in the base case, but effectively that scenario is null and void because it operated the condition of this motor being online. And so the moral of the story is, if I have scenarios that change the condition of any of the elements, and then in the base case I remove that element from the overall file, I'm going to end up with a lot of errors. Okay, it seems to kind of follow just on this basic example. And going back to short circuit focus, if I look at the equipment duty, I can see that everything works here. If I look at what I was expecting to see is, the scenario. Again, this is another nuance, is that I can't look at other scenarios when I'm in short circuit focus. I can save them, and again, that complicates my methodology. So in my mind, I probably not want to do that unless I have some specific analysis that I needed to save, and I knew I wasn't going to make changes. What I did want to look at is my base case results. And again, because I've changed the breaker that was the offending object in the equipment duty, it's not going to show up as a problem. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Let me see if we got some questions here before we jump into. Yeah, there are some questions, and we may not be able to answer them all online, but let's see what we say. The guidelines that I'm suggesting is you want to save your base case and aware of what you're saving when the tool inquires if you want to save as you're closing out of it or going to another scenario. Any changes to the base case will carry across the scenarios. And this was the question that I got multiple times, and that is, oftentimes we'll design a system using either generic or one manufacturer, and when we have discussions with the client, they either want to use a different manufacturer at one case or across the board, and so we need to change the base case conditions. Will that carry across all of the scenarios we've created? The answer is yes, and that's why I'm suggesting you want to be a little bit careful what you've developed off of a base case, and then when you make changes to it, what's going to be null and void. In the case of the large file that we were talking about a couple weeks ago, the solution was to negate or to delete all of the existing scenarios, but based upon the condition that was described in the label, go back and recreate the scenarios with the current base case, because that was judged to be the most accurate one-line condition. Okay, so questions. There's a question about no sound to start with. Sorry if that was a problem. Do you have a general strategy for developing an exhaustive list of scenarios that will be needed in a typical design? You know, that was my reason for asking the question and for bringing up the topic. If you go in and look at this large file, motor contribution was significant, but it didn't really change the results, at least in the system as it existed. Because they had the devices that were developed or were highlighted as violating equipment duty compliance, did so whether there was motor contribution or not. So the scheme, I think, in my mind, is looking at your equipment duty report. If you're within 10%, then I would reconsider. If you're within 10% of the rating of the device, I'd strongly recommend that you look at with and without motor contribution. But I think that can be derived, that need can be derived based upon what I looked at when I do a full system on and off scenario. Now, that's just one man's opinion, and your conditions may be different. So if you have questions along that line, or if you have a system that's giving you headaches, I would suggest contacting EasyPower tech support, and they might be able to provide you with more specific feedback. So the question is, do you have a general strategy for developing an exhaustive? And again, that's what the IEEE recommendation is, and they're saying that you need to use engineering judgment when you're considering different scenarios. How do I fix the error while keeping the fuse? Well, that's a good question, Michael. Essentially, I have to delete that one motor scenario, recreate it by exercising the switched fuse and saving that as my new one motor scenario. And at that point, I will be able to compare the fuse in that one motor configuration. It says, is there a way to enter transformer tolerances positive for load flow and negative for short circuit? That's a good question. I haven't tried it. My first reaction is, in fact, it's a good exercise to take on just as a personal challenge, and that is create one base case with transformer tolerances in. So the question is load flow. The answer is, I believe, yes, that I can use scenarios for load flow, and this is, and the reason I say that with a fair amount of confidence is that the Scenario Manager primarily was developed for load flow comparisons, and I will try that offline and then send out the results via email to anyone that's attended the webinar. So that kind of concludes where we were headed for today. I appreciate everyone attending. I would suggest you check out the website. We have all the regional training locations set for the rest of the year. There's also an announcement, as you saw on the tools headlines slide. We also now have online training, which is effectively the same content as a regional training class available for tool owners. And you're welcome to contact training@easypower.com for more details on that. Thank you all for attending and hope you have a good week. So long.